We know that seals are important material culture from the Indus civilization. And though they are often described as being standardized and highly uniform, there is actually a lot of variation in Indus seals. And this is the main thing that we are interested in studying. We use multifaceted approaches to investigate variation in Indus seals from a diachronic perspective. Our research builds on earlier studies to explore and explain variation in Indus seals and try to use this information to make connections with social, political, and economic organization and integration and the people who made and used seals in the Indus. We define seals as carved, engraved, and inscribed objects that were used to encode culturally significant information. Seals as a class of artifacts or material culture can be distinguished from related materials, including tablets and seal impressions and sealings, for example, in a variety of different ways, including the raw materials used to make them, their morphology, size and shape, their production technologies, not only in terms of the way that they were carved, but also other features, including presence frequently of carved knobs or bosses on their rear faces and perforation, and also the function and use of seals. People of the Indus were not the only ancient cultures to make and use seals. In fact, many other ancient cultures did. However, Indus seals are quite distinct from other ancient cultures, including ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, and have been studied extensively in the Indus for over 100 years. Next slide, please. Because seals have been studied for over 100 years, there is lots of important and valuable previous research on Indus seals. And all of this earlier research collectively has influenced our research in the ways that we think about and study seals in a variety of ways. Much of the earliest and significant research on Indus seals focused on description, classification, and morphology. In fact, it was these early studies that really helped define the Indus civilization as distinct and unique from other ancient cultures in other parts of Asia, say, for example, Mesopotamia, and the recognition that Indus seals are very unique and distinct. More recent research focusing on production methods, the function and uses of seals, and especially studies of the Indus script, have also contributed significantly to our understanding of the significance of Indus seals. However, comparatively less research has been conducted that focuses on variability among Indus seals and especially change over time among Indus seals. There are, of course, several notable exceptions to this, including studies conducted by Ameri, Frank-Vogt, some of my earlier research, a number of studies conducted by Professor Mark Knoyer and Meadow, and also Paul Rissman. Our research focuses on diachronic variation in Indus seals using complementary research methods, which include classification and documentation, distribution patterns, various methods of formal analyses to understand style, and also technological analyses using microscopic studies, including scanning electron microscopy. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we are going to start from the seals of the pre-urban period dating to 3500 BCE to 2600 BCE. So far, we have 159 seals from the pre-urban period, and most of them have geometric motifs. So on the image on the right side, I mean, you can see the variety of the motifs, which are predominantly represented by geometric motifs. And the use of different types of materials, that is steatite, terracotta, ivory or bone, copper, bronze, shell, bitumen. So the use of the kind of different types of materials to produce seals indicates that the access to different material sources and different production technologies were developed in different parts of the Indus region. So based on the materials, shapes, and designs and iconography, the distribution pattern of the seals of the pre-urban period can be divided into two regions, northern and southern regions. So steatite was predominantly used in the northern region that is comprised of Bannu, Gomal, Punjab, and the Gagal. So these are the examples from the northern regions. So they are predominantly made of fired steatite, and they have a small knob on the back side. So you can see a variety of the geometric motifs around here, I mean, except for a few specimens which depict the animal motif. And these are the examples from the southern region. They are predominantly made of terracotta, and instead of the knob, the holes were perforated to thread a cord to hold them. So these two regional groups of pre-urban seals are very, very distinctive. And at the same time, I mean, there is evidence of the interaction between these two groups. So in the case of the southern, in the case of the southern regions, I mean, you can find a few seals which are identical to the seals from northern region. So that's the evidence of interaction between the northern and southern regions. So based on the materials and shapes and the motifs, and as I told you just now, I mean, they demonstrate the distinctive regional styles. So both of them emerged during the early third millennium. So some of them date back to the late fourth millennium BCE, but the most of them emerged during the early third millennium BCE, just before the emergence of the Indus urban system. So there was a kind of interactions between the two regions. So these are the maps of the distribution, spatial distribution of elements across the Indus region. So this is the southern region, and this is the northern region. So the materials and the shapes and the holding devices, that means the knob and holes, and the motifs, they all indicate that the seals of the pre-urban period can be divided into two regions. So this is a northern group, and this is a southern group. So it seems to me that each of two groups had its own origin in the connection with different parts of the Iranian plateau, because the many elements from the southern group has a connection with the southeastern part of the Iranian plateau, which is represented by the evidence from Shafri Softa in the southern southeastern Iran. And in the case of the northern group, I mean, they have elements similar to the seals from the northeastern part of the Iranian plateau. So, I mean, there was a kind of connection between the Indus region and the Iranian plateau, and they gave some kind of impetus to create seals in the Indus region, especially the northern and southern groups. So the northern group, which was widespread in Bannu, Gomal, Punjab, and Gagal, this region, has morphological and technological similarities to the steatite square seals of the urban period. I mean, the next period, which will be explained by Gregg. But there is a stylistic gap between the pre-urban and urban seals. That means the northern group of pre-urban seals and urban seals, especially on the motifs. So in the case of the pre-urban period, pre-urban seals, I mean, the geometric motif is predominant, but in the case of the seals from the urban period, the animal motif is dominant or dominating. So, I mean, that kind of stylistic gap is a big question for the developments of the seals in this region, but it's a very big issue for future research. So the diversity in the seal styles and the emergence of widespread types suggests complexity of the social organization and the interregional relationships during the pre-urban period. So the pre-urban period can be regarded as a period uh, of the foundation of the development of the fully developed urban system during the urban period or the mature Harappan period. So even in the period of the pre-urban period, I mean, there was a very complex picture of, I mean, which must be explained by seals. Okay, so I'm going to switch to Greg.
Thank you, Akinori.
Yep.
I'd like to talk now more about seals of the urban period, also known as the mature Harappan period, which corresponds with the Harappa phase of the integration era using the chronological framework from Harappa. One of the first things that we can see by studying and comparing seals of the urban period is that there is actually a lot of variation and diversity, especially in terms of their iconographic motifs. Now, to the extent that many seals from the urban period are often square in shape, created from fired steatite, and often contain a short inscription or animal motif, there is some level of standardization. However, not all seals from the urban period have animal motifs and inscriptions. In fact, there are a wide variety of different types, including those, as you can see on the left here, that continue to depict geometric motifs with no inscriptions, a wide variety of different animal motifs, anthropomorphic and composite motifs. We get seals that are not square at all, but rather rectangular. We get a wide variety of different sizes and shapes, including some that are also circular. That represents a large degree of diversity. Now, even when we look at seals of the urban period that are primarily contain short inscriptions and animal motifs, we can also see that there is a lot of variation in terms of the different kinds of animals and other scenes that are represented. Many earlier studies have addressed this. This is not a new observation. We know that Indus seals have a wide variety of different animal motifs and narrative scenes. What is interesting to note and important, however, is that we can see by studying and comparing these different animal motifs, specifically the carving styles of different animal motifs, that there is change in the carving style of seals during the urban period over time. And a very simplified example of this you can see on the bottom of this screen, where we have unicorn seals that are carved in a variety of different styles, shapes, and orientations. One of the most important transitions or changes that we have identified, as well as others, is a gradual shift from animals that face to the right, which you see on the left here, during what we think is probably the earlier stages of the urban period, to animals that face to the left during the later stages. We can also see during the later stages what we would define as style 2 or stylistic group number 2, a much wider variety of different animal motifs that appear on seals and much greater distribution. Next slide, please. Our research on seals from the urban period, and here we focus specifically on typical square seals that have animal motifs and inscriptions, has identified many sources of variation. And these are best understood and identified through detailed comparative studies using multiple methods, which we employ in our research. There are at least 4 broad sources or categories of variation that we have identified, including raw materials and tools, production methods and operational sequences, diachronic change and variation, and also idiosyncratic carving styles. We know, based on earlier archaeological research, that during the urban period, Indus craftspeople were using steatite from a wide variety of different sources, different colors, different textures, and this is largely based on the work of Dr. Randall Law. And you can see 2 examples of steatite here that are clearly distinct from each other. Now, even though we don't know exactly what kinds of tools were used to carve Indus seals, we have a decent idea of what kinds of tools might have been based on the recovery of a wide variety of different implements from archaeological sites and contexts, including this series of bone tools from Farmana, pictured on the bottom left, and also a wide variety of copper and bronze implements, chisels, rods, and other tools from Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and other sites. We can also study and compare the kinds of tools that were used to carve seals by studying impressions of engraved surfaces under the scanning electron microscope. I'll talk more momentarily about idiosyncratic carving styles, and we can also see variation in a wide variety of different ways that individual seals had different forms or methods of carving and engraving individual elements. Finally, we can see some evidence of variation in operational sequences in the production of seals, which I'll talk more about momentarily as well. Next slide, please. In terms of evidence of variation in raw materials, tools, production methods, and operational sequences, there are well-known examples of seals recovered at archaeological sites, which clearly demonstrate that different sources of steatite were used and that those different sources of steatite were subjected to different production methods. Here in the upper left of this slide are shown two seal fragments recovered from the site of Bagasra. And these two images are shown and shared courtesy of MS University of Baroda. The one on the left here we can see in the broken section contains a gray-green steatite that has not been fired white all the way through. Yet another seal fragment from the same site, which you can see here on the bottom right, does have a section that has been fired white all the way through. We can see other examples of these in both finished and unfinished seals, which demonstrate or suggest that different raw materials were used and that different production processes, specifically the transformation of steatite to having a white or whitish finished surface, were different. Now, I've already alluded to the tools, and even though we don't know exactly what kinds of tools were used, by comparing the engraved surfaces of seals by studying their impressions under the scanning electron microscope, we can clearly see that different kinds of tools that made different kinds of signatures on the engraved surfaces were used. And finally, we know that operational sequences in making seals during the urban phase also varied, because in some instances we have unfinished or discarded seals in which animal motif was carved first, and others in which the script or inscription appears to have been carved first. Most of these observations have been made in earlier studies. However, the combination of different techniques that we are using to explore and try to interpret this are really what is new and unique about our approach. Next slide, please. We have also been able to document diachronic change and variation in the carving styles of Indus seals during the urban period. Specifically, our research is focused on those seals that have the unicorn motif because they are the most abundant at most Indus sites. Building on the work of Knoyer in 2006, originally and since then, which helped create and refine a chronology of seal carving styles based on stratigraphically controlled excavations at Harappa, it is possible to identify and track changes in the carving styles of Indus unicorn seals over time. So in the earliest phases, we can see, as I mentioned earlier, that unicorn seals have right-facing animals, which are often carved with very bold, angular styles. They tend to have very short inscriptions, and there is an absence of a standard below the animal's head. During what we define as style 1B, we can see that we still have right-facing animals, which have bold angular carving styles, but the inscriptions are becoming longer and more complex, and we see the appearance of the standard beneath the animal. What we call style 2A represents another transitional style. Unicorns of this particular type still have very bold angular carving styles, but the animals are now left facing, have complex inscriptions and standards. In style 2B and style 2BB, we see that the animals are left facing, and it's here largely that the inscriptions change. They become more linear, more regular in their orientation and spacing, and generally also become longer. And finally, what we call style 2BC, which correlates roughly to period 3C at Harappa. We see seals that are very, very finely made, very well engraved and decorated with quite linear, regular inscriptions. So this is a good example of how, by studying seals using a variety of different methods, we can identify and track diachronic change and variation. We can also see further evidence of variation in the distribution patterns of seals during the urban phase by morphology, type, and also animal iconography. Next slide, please. We can see diachronic variation in the distribution of unicorn seals using the stylistic framework that I've already referenced, developed by our own research and the work of others, especially Professor Mark Knoyer. During the early phases of unicorn seal production, what we define as stylistic group number 1, unicorn seals are fairly restricted in their distribution. They occur at the major urban sites of Mohenjo-Daro and a few others in the Gagar-Hakra region, and to a lesser extent at a few other sites throughout the Indus. During what we call stylistic group 2, which correlates to the later stages of the urban period, we can see a much wider distribution of unicorn seals that depict and bear left-facing animals. Next slide, please. By comparing the distribution and mapping out the distribution of Indus seals with animal motifs during the urban period, we can also see significant differences in variation based on the type of animals that are represented on the seals. Unicorns, for example, as we've already mentioned, are very widely distributed, especially in the second half of the urban period, what would correlate with period 3B and 3C at Harappa. By contrast, other rhinoceros and even multi-headed composite animals. One of the best examples of this is by comparing tiger seals, which occur in far fewer numbers, but even a brief examination reveals that the ways in which different parts of the animals that appear on Indus seals were carved and decorated vary considerably. We argue that at least some of this is based on unique idiosyncratic carving styles and skills, and reflect the fact that different people made Indus seals during the urban period. Next slide, please. One of the best ways to study and explore this, and one of our unique contributions to the study of diversity in seals from the Indus, is to conduct formal stylistic and metric analyses of animals and inscriptions to try to learn more about this idiosyncratic, unique variation in carving styles. This is also useful for identifying pattern variation among multiple seals that represent the different artisans and workshops that made and use seals. So we have conducted these studies on a variety of different animal motifs. My dissertation research, for example, focused on formal analyses of unicorn seals, which included breaking down the unicorn motif into a variety of different compositional elements, also taking measurements of these same elements, including maximum length and maximum width. And by comparing and analyzing these data, it's been possible to identify stylistically and proportionally similar groups of seals that we argue represent the products of different artisans and workshops. Since then, we've also conducted similar analyses with other animal motifs, including tiger seals, and are currently working on research on a variety of other motifs as well. Next slide, please. This pattern variation and carving styles we infer represent stylistically distinct seal groups made by the same artisans and workshops. And this includes the identification of seals with different animals. It's not, and this unique and very significant composite three-headed animal, Dolavira. Some of the stylistic groups that we have identified so far have single distributions, and these are generally distributed at major urban centers, including Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dolavira. But we've also identified examples from smaller regional sites, including Lotal, pictured at the bottom left of the screen here, Kalibanga, and even remarkably, the small site of Bagasra. Next slide, please. Other stylistic groups that we've identified have much more complex multi-site distribution patterns, which include regional groups, interregional groups, and even a few examples of stylistic connections between an Indus site and another site where an Indus seal was recovered outside of the Indus. So a few examples of the regional multi-site seal groups we've identified include this pair, one from Lotal, one from Bagasra in Gujarat. You can see just by simple visual inspection that stylistically, the way the unicorns are engraved and proportionally, they are very, very similar. Same phenomenon with this pair from Kalibanga and Harappa. Other multi-site groups we have identified are comprised of more complex long-distance interregional groups, including this pair of Zebu seals, one from Dolavira, one from Mohenjo-Daro, and an even more remarkable and unique trio of seals comprised of one from Balakot and two from Banavali. Finally, even more remarkable, we have identified one pair of seals that demonstrate stylistic connections and links between a site in the Indus, Mohenjo-Daro, and one of the few published unicorn seals recovered from a site in Mesopotamia. The one on the left here is from ancient Kish. The distribution of these stylistic seal groups that we have identified strongly suggests a decentralized form of seal production and use. In other words, our data indicate that seals were being made in different sites by different people all over the Indus. And this in turn suggests a decentralized form of socio-political organization and control throughout the Indus as a whole. Next slide.
Okay, so this is my turn again. So actually, along with the steatite square seal, which depict the different kinds of animals, I mean, there is a fair amount of seals with geometric motifs. So I mean, even in the urban period, I mean, between 2600 and 1900 BCE. So I mean, they have been almost neglected by scholars. I mean, in previous research, but they clearly exhibit the continuity of the pre-urban tradition. So these are the geometric seals of the pre-urban period, and you can find I put the several examples here, but you can see the clear continuity of the motifs into the urban period. So the idiosyncratic motifs indicate the production and uses are different from that of the animal seals. The coexistence of geometric seals and animal seals points to the diverse, multi-layered, and complex social organization in this urban society. We assume that the different types of seals were used by different communities or different people or different social groups. So I mean, this kind of geometric seals was one of the indicators of that kind of multi-layered or complex social organization during the urban period. And the post-urban period on the top of this image, I mean, you can see the same kind of geometric motifs even in the post-urban period. So there is a clear continuity from the pre-urban period through urban period to post-urban period in the sense of the, in terms of the geometric motifs. So this is a distribution of the geometric seals during the urban period. So that is as extensive as that of the animal seals. So it's very extensive distribution down here. So it's very, I mean, we have to focus on this spatial distribution more and more, but it's very distinctive pattern of the geometric motifs. And when you look at the knob type or the holding device, I mean, on the back side of the seals, I mean, you can see some variations. So during the pre-urban period, I mean, as I told you earlier, so there are two types, I mean, hold type and the knob type. So during this period, the knob is very small, truncated, conical. And during the urban period, the different type of knobs were introduced. This is one of the newly introduced knob, semi-cylindrical, which is distinctively seen on the animal seals in the early stage of the urban period. And then in the later phase of the urban period, this kind of double knob, I mean the double boss, was developed on the backside of the seals. So, I mean, in the case of the knobs, I mean, you can see the variations and the diversities, and they might indicate the, you know, the different production system and different distribution pattern, or maybe different, I mean, different kinds of the social organization. So this is a seals from the post-urban period. I mean, after the decline of the Indus period. So the seals from the post-urban period are limited in number and its distribution area confined to central Balochistan and Sindh. There are just three sites, I mean, which have yielded the seals of the post-urban period. But the presence clearly indicates that some administrative and economic transactions were active in these regions, but the scale of spatial distribution is totally different from that of the urban period. The disappearance of the seals with figurative motifs, I mean, dominantly animal of the urban period has not been well dated. I mean, we don't know much about the date when the transition from the urban period seal to the post-urban seals happened, but it suggests a kind of disintegration of the urban system of the during urban period and transformation to a different social state. As I explained to you earlier, I mean, there is a bunch of geometric seals during the post-urban period, though they are limited to the just three sites in Balochistan and Sindh. So this is a slide for the conclusion. So seals as tools for administration and economic control are one of the best archaeological evidence to better understand the relationships between communities and interregional relationships. The diachronic changes, I mean, that's the stylistic and technological of seals from the pre-urban to post-urban periods signify the complex interregional relationships and interactions in this region. So regarding the pre-urban seals, it indicates the emergence of complex societies and extensive interregional relationships that covered the very extensive area of the Indus region. And during the urban period, the seals demonstrate both the emergence of highly organized production and distribution system across the region, I mean, which must have been much more complicated and much more complex than that of the pre-urban period. And you know, the complex multi-layered social organization can be indicated by this complex picture of the seals of the urban period. And the post-urban seals implies the general decline of complex social organization and the transition to a different social state. So, I mean, this presentation was just a, you know, overview of the current studies and the previous research. So more studies are needed to better characterize the diversity and commonality in seals, especially in connection to the emergence of complex society, starting from the pre-urban period. And of course, the interregional interaction system is also a very important key factor for better understanding the complex picture of the seals. And we have to do more research to better understand how they were maintained. I mean, that kind of complexity or the standardization or uniformity, how they were maintained through what kind of organization of production and distribution. So, I mean, this is our presentation. Thank you very much.